You're tuned in to the Tithing Hoax podcast, where we offer teachings, commentary, and insights about false tithing doctrines and the prosperity gospel. Today's topic, we're going to talk about a pastor in India who is charged and arrested for stealing over $500,000 from the church treasury. But before we get into that topic, today's podcast is sponsored by the Tithing Hoax, exposing the lies, myths, and misinterpretations about tithing. Inside this Amazon best-selling book, you'll discover the truth about tithes the church doesn't want you to know. Free yourself from the tithe deception today. Get your copy of the Tithing Hoax on Amazon.com and wherever books are sold. So now let's get into today's topic. I came across an article about a pastor in India who was arrested and charged for embezzling church funds. The gentleman's name, and please forgive me if I mess up his name, it's not intentional, so forgive me. The pastor is Alfast Beret the Chowkidar, and he's the pastor of the Makar Presbyterian Church in India. And this is basically what would be considered a mega church. It has a membership of 10,000 church members. And it turns out that if I did my currency conversion correctly, dating all the way back to 2013 up until 2019, when it was discovered that he was, I'm going to say allegedly, embezzling money from the church, the amount of money translated into US dollars is $675,000, somewhere along in there. So allegedly, he embezzled almost $700,000 in tithes, offerings, and donations from his church members. Now, based on the article, I'm not really clear how this fraudulent behavior, alleged fraudulent behavior was discovered, but the article does emphasize that it was the young people in the church who had been pushing for justice when they discovered what was going on, and that the pastor was allegedly using the church money, the tithes and the offerings, and funneling that money into his own business. So he was using these tithes and the offerings allegedly for his own personal use, for his own business. And so, based on the article and the way I understand it, it was the young people in the church who were pushing for justice and pushing for him to be charged, arrested and charged for this fraudulent behavior. Now, what is interesting is, when something controversial, whatever the nature of the controversy, goes down in the church, you're going to have those church members who say, hey, this is foul, something needs to be done. And then you're going to have those other church members who are kind of like, well, let's cover pastor in prayer, and let's forgive and forget, and let's deal with this in house. And in the article, it suggests that there were older members who kind of wanted to keep things on the low. They did not support the fact that the younger church members were being so vocal about this, because the impression I got is that the older church members wanted to kind of keep things in-house. Let's deal with church business inside the church. And they wanted to protect the church's reputation. So the young people alleging that, hey, there's a lot of church politics going on, and they ain't with the politics. They're wanting justice. So an issue that I wanted to bring up in my commentary here is, were the young church members wrong for seeking justice outside of the church and going to law enforcement and allowing the worldly system, if you will, to handle church business? Because it seems to me that the young people looking at, look, a crime is a crime. Stealing is stealing. Embezzlement is embezzlement. Fraud is fraud. Church, whether it happens in the church or not, this person committed a crime, and their position is then he should, this pastor, we don't care that it's the pastor. This pastor engaged allegedly in criminal behavior, and so he needs to be dealt with as a criminal would be dealt with in any other sector of society. And that's their position, it seems like to me. So were they wrong in seeking justice outside of the church, or is this a matter or situation that the church should have dealt with, and the secular world should have been kept out of church business? Because I've heard in the past where there are people in the church who have that position or hold that perspective. If anything goes down in the church that is corrupt or foul or whatever the case, out of order, let the church folk deal with church folk, and let church business be handled within the four walls of the church. Don't get the world involved in church business. So I will say this. My position, according to the Bible, is that, leaders in the church should face penalties for stealing tithes, offerings, and donations, from stealing from the church treasury. So these young people were justified in seeking justice. Now, you may have issues as to how they went about it, but they did do, from a biblical standpoint, they were justified in seeking justice. Because here's what the Bible tells us, and we learn a lot when we read about and we study the relationship God had and still has, but God has with the Israelites, with ancient Israel, and his relationship and his covenant with them. Now, first of all, we have to look at the nature and the character of God. So when it comes to theft and thievery, let's go to Isaiah chapter 61, verse 8. And in it says, and this is the King James Version, it says, "For I, the Lord, love judgment." And in some translations it says justice, because God is a God of justice. He says, "For I, the Lord, love judgment. I hate robbery, for burnt offering, and I will direct their work in truth, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them," talking about Israel. But the point is to say, look, God loves judgment or justice, and he hates robbery. So we know that that is part of God's character, a lover of justice, and he hates robbery, he hates theft, he hates the stealing of what offerings, tithes, offerings, and just stealing, period. And the Bible further supports this, and we see again a reflection of God's character, and he wanted his character reflected in his people. So let's go over to Exodus chapter 20, verse 15. So here in Exodus, this is where God establishes his covenant with Israel, and he gives them the first commandments, and these first commandments are what? The 10 commandments. So verse 15, within the context of the 10 commandments, it says this: "Thou shalt not steal. Should not do what? Steal. Should not do what? Steal. Should not do what? Steal. So within the first commandments of the covenant, God talks about stealing. He did not want the children of Israel to steal. So you understand that this was a priority for the Lord, that this was something that was very important. It made the top 10. Don't steal. Okay? So the Lord did not want the Israelites stealing from one another. Very important. And another thing that I find interesting when we dive a little bit deeper into the issue of stealing and how God views stealing, and how, God wanted the Israelites, how he wanted them to move and operate it, and to operate in terms of, other people's property, in terms of not stealing, is that the Bible also says that when an Israelite steals or robs from another Israelite, it's the equivalent of stealing and robbing from God. Okay, so let's go over here to Leviticus and see what I'm talking about. And we're looking at Leviticus chapter 6, verses 2 through 6. And this is in the New King James Version. And it says, this is verse 2. It says, if a person sins and commits a trespass against the Lord by lying to his neighbor about what was delivered to him for safekeeping, and about a pledge, or about a robbery, or if he has extorted from his neighbor, or if he has found what was lost and lies concerning it and swears falsely, in any of these things that a man may do in which he sins. Okay, so that was verses 2 and 3. But the point is, in that first line, I like, let's pay attention. If a person sins and commits a trespass against the Lord by doing these things to his neighbor. So again, like I just said, this is Bible, that from God's perspective, and we look at in terms of his covenant with Israel, whenever Israel committed a sin against his neighbor, of his, his fellow Israelite, any type of trespass, any type of lying, any type of deception, any of those type of behaviors, any type of wrongdoing against a fellow Israelite is the same as doing it against God. You violate your fellow Israelites, you are violating God. So we see that God wanted the Israelites to deal uprightly and fairly with their fellow Israelites. And we can go even deeper and to see how serious the Lord takes stealing. And we look at, again, his covenant and his relationship with the Israelites. Because if an Israelite was found guilty of stealing, there had to be a penalty paid for that. It wasn't, oh, just forgive and forget. No, boo-boo. No, there's a penalty to be paid. And in the penalty, it was that not only were the goods or property, whatever was stolen, had to be returned, it had to be returned with a little something added on to it. Okay, so we see this if you look at still in Leviticus chapter 6, and we go into verse 4 through 6. It says, then it shall be, because he has sinned and is guilty, that he shall restore what he has stolen, or the thing which he has extorted, or what was delivered to him for safekeeping, or the lost thing which he found, or all that about which he has sworn falsely. He shall restore its full value and add 1/5 more to it, and give it to whomever it belongs on the day of his trespass offering. So we're talking about justice. We're talking about penalty, and we're talking about justice. And we're talking about thievery and deception. So that's how, the Lord wanted the children of Israel to deal with, issues like that. Not only do you need to return what you stole, you need to add a little something extra to it. So if you want to use the Lord's covenant relationship with Israel as it relates to robbery and theft and stealing, and use it as a point of reference for the Christian church, on that basis, we can make the argument that yes, these young people in that church in India had every right to seek justice, because the Bible supports justice. The Bible speaks against thievery, stealing, and theft, and the Bible supports the restoration of what was stolen, plus adding on to that whatever was stolen from another individual. So, I applaud the young people for taking that step and say we're not just going to, and they even said it in the article, said we're not just going to forgive and forget, because this is what what they had to say. This is what they point out. And give me a moment here. I'm finding. Okay, here's what it says. He says, and because we are a church, we have to be more accountable than secular institutions, the young member said. And they said, adding that just because the fraud happened in church does not mean that everything should be forgive and forget. That's the young folk. That's the young folks. And I applaud them, because they're holding the church and the members of the church to a higher standard. Like, we got to do right. So just because it was the pastor, and allegedly they thinking maybe the treasurer was also involved, but just because the bottom line, the church leadership is involved in misbehavior or criminal activity, just because it's a church and they're Christians and this happens in the church, you don't overlook it and give the pastor or anybody else a pass. And so, that's something, because we know in these churches, pastors get a whole lot of passes for doing some janky things. So I applaud those young members over there at it's the Makar Church, Presbyterian Church in India. So yeah. So my position is, they had every right to seek justice and to hold, the pastor and anyone else, hold them accountable and hold them to a higher standard. And that, no, you don't get a pass. If you do something illegal and criminal, then you do the crime. What did it say? You do the crime and you pay the time. So it is what it is. So what's your position? What do you think that when something transpires in the church, and a member of the church was the pastor, the treasurer, the deacon, or assistant pastor, or whatever, if they do something that is inappropriate or even illegal, is that something that should be kept within the church and is for the church members to deal with exclusively, and to keep the world out of church business? Or are you of the position that if there's some wrongdoing in the church and it's a legal activity and it's criminal activity, that no, that just because it took place in the church, it shouldn't stay in the church, that individual, whether it's a pastor or anyone else, that individual needs to be charged with the crime they commit, and that you should seek justice outside of the four walls of the church? Let me know what you think. So anyway, if you have enjoyed today's Tithing Hoax podcast, please share it on your social media platforms. Let's spread the truth about tithes together. Until next time, I'm Renee. Thank you for listening and be blessed.